Brilliant. So welcome to this, our latest Labour Housing Group in conversation with. My name's Alison Inman, I'm Vice Chair of LHG, and we've got our new chair tonight. So a big welcome to Jack Shaw, who is a man with even more hats than I have, a man of many hats, who is going to talk to us this afternoon tonight about temporary accommodation. So Jack's the chair of Labour Housing Group. He's a councillor in the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham. Up until possibly last week, worked at Labour Together. I don't think he got sacked, so that's all right. There's no scandal attached there. And is a research fellow of more august institutions than you can shake a stick at. But Jack's made a real name for himself in the last few years working on temporary accommodation. And we will drown in the housing sector in statistics about housing. We are really, really good at writing reports with lots of numbers in and telling the story of the housing crisis in lots of different ways. But I think the absolute, if you want to see the absolute manifestation of a housing crisis, it's the fact that too many children, too many families are living in temporary accommodation. That's accommodation that is neither temporary in a lot of cases, nor is it fit to be described as in any way adequate. So Jack, I wrote a report recently for Citizens UK, and I'm sure he'll touch on that later tonight. But one of the things that I took away from that report was one of the recommendations, and given that we live in one of the richest countries on earth, one of the recommendations was that we ought to enshrine in legislation a right to wash in temporary accommodation. And if that isn't an indictment of the searing inequalities within our society, then I don't know what is. So Jack's going to talk for about 20 minutes, Jack?
Yeah, about 15-20 minutes.
Brilliant. And then we'll open it up for questions and a discussion. The next 20 minutes will be spent with Jack trying to share his screen. We've had a practice, one of them worked, one of them less so. So over to you, Jack.
Lovely, thanks, Alison. And great to see you all on what, as Alison said, is a kind of really hot day out there. So fair play to you to be committed to a housing policy on a Monday evening. I'm gonna share this screen. Let's see if it works. Right, bear with me.
Now, this has lost its freshness. It's still entirely drinkable. What's more prominent is the.
Well, can you see my screen?
Yeah, we're back to seeing two screens.
Okay, damn. Let me try again. One more time. If there isn't a tech issue, there's
a competence.
Isn't really a. There we go. It isn't really a Zoom meeting, is it? Okay, I think you're back to one screen now.
Brilliant.
Got that right.
Good.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again, everyone, for joining us. These in conversations can't happen if people don't support the Labour Housing Group and they don't turn up to these events. So hopefully this is not going to be a kind of 45 minutes wasted. And I'm sure some of you can kind of tuck into your dinner while you're listening on the sofa. So I'm going to speak a little bit about temporary accommodation today, some of the kind of research that I've been unpacking over the last couple of years, and sketch out really a lot of the kind of challenges and bring to life the kind of issues that ordinary people are facing in the UK and in particular England. I'm going to offer some solutions, but I'm going to be really tentative about those, and hopefully that's the opportunity we have afterwards to kind of talk about what the solutions are and have a conversation about that. But really, I've got lots of hopefully useful graphs and charts and so on So, I mean, if we start in 2010, imagine 2010, Labour has left office. The number of households in temporary accommodation is falling. It falls about half between 2005 and 2010. There are about 100,000, 101,000 households in temporary accommodation in late 2005. By 2010, it was just under 50,000. So the previous Labour government made a huge amount of progress. And unfortunately, 15 years later, that progress has not only been reversed, but we now have nearly 130,000 households in temporary accommodation, including 164,000 children. And so the scale of temporary accommodation is at unprecedented levels. It's never been higher. And the reasons for that are kind of multiple in kind. You know, the country has consistently failed to build. For example, in this image here, you can see the net additional homes that have been built over the years. Now, this government has set a kind of ambition of building on average 300,000 a year across this parliament. It expects them to ramp up over time. So towards the end of this parliament, it should be over 300,000, and over the next year or two, it might be below. But that just gives you a kind of scale of the kind of ambition that the government set out, but also where we are at this stage. You know, if you look from 1970 onwards, we have failed to kind of consistently build at the scale of which we need to. And that's resulted, and that's kind of been particularly in London and the South East, and resulted in high housing costs there. At the same time, there have been various government policies, and I won't kind of speak to all of them, but I'll just surface the kind of obvious ones which you will be familiar with, that have undermined or exacerbated the housing crisis and homelessness further. So in this image, you can see the depletion of social housing stock through right to buy, and effectively the purple in the image there is the number of properties that have been sold or lost across England, across our social housing stock. So our social housing stock has been getting smaller over time. And then there are other policies like the local housing allowance. Housing benefit hasn't kept pace with housing costs. The Conservatives consistently chose to freeze housing benefit, freeze local housing allowance rather. And again, that has made it kind of more difficult for households to identify kind of suitable accommodation or to remain in suitable accommodation. And this has kind of manifested itself in all sorts of different ways. You know, insufficient supply, frozen benefits, the sale of social housing, other kind of wider factors such as slow growth in kind of wages, a poor or lagging kind of economy have really kind of exacerbated the housing crisis. And I'm going to focus on homelessness as the kind of key way in which it's manifested itself, but there are other ways too. And here we just see an image of housing quality. So the proportion of adults reporting problems with their housing quality across different tenures. And in the rented sector and in the private rented sector, that's kind of particularly pronounced. Another example might be this work by, I can't remember if it was Crisis or Shelter recently, where they looked at increases in rent over time and measured that against kind of ordinary items that you would use. And here, of course, you can see just how ludicrous it is that if the pint of 4 pints of milk or 6 bananas rose in line with rents, you know, you'd be paying 12, 13 quid for those kind of essentials. So it just gives you a sense of the speed at which renters have faced increasing costs. But as I say, I'm going to focus on temporary accommodation as the kind of symptom in this case. Now, the crisis is most acute in London. What are you looking at here? You're looking at an image of London broken down by local authority. And the numbers in each local authority are the number of households in temporary accommodation. And the crisis is most acute in London and Manchester and Birmingham, but it's not a crisis in every city, and it's not confined to cities. So it's a kind of national problem. There are plenty of rural areas, particularly in London in the southeast, that haven't built homes and have low levels of affordability that equally face kind of particularly difficult challenges. And in this image, I'd point to Newham, just to the centre left there, which has 6,667 households in temporary accommodation. It's an astonishing figure. And Newham, as a local authority, is almost bankrupt, in part as a result of the costs of temporary accommodation. And for the first time, I've really tried to kind of map this. And so here's an example of Manchester. You've still got 2,775 households in Manchester City Council alone that are in temporary accommodation. And again, if you look at Birmingham, over 5,000 households in Birmingham, but not solely Birmingham. You look over to Coventry, there's still over 1,000 households there. So it's a really acute challenge, and it faces kind of all sorts of different people. So families, particularly women with children, and individuals, particularly single men, but all sorts of people are affected by temporary accommodation. And I'll show you another map of that in a moment. This just gives you a picture of the places where temporary accommodation is most acute. So if you look on the left-hand side, you see clearly London is by some way the most acute, but there are plenty of places outside of London that have got 1,000 or more than 1,000 households in temporary accommodation. So it again, just to reinforce the kind of acute nature of that challenge. And some of those households will be in temporary accommodation since the 1990s. Indeed, that's what we found in the research that Alison mentioned that we published just last month. Some people have been in temporary accommodation for nearly 30 years. Now, some of those people are pregnant, they might be fleeing domestic abuse, they might be Uber drivers, they might be teaching assistants. These are all individuals that I've met and spoken to in temporary accommodation. I've spoken to local authorities that are now supporting staff that are in temporary accommodation, and I've even spoken to a politician that was in temporary accommodation. So it really does kind of affect everyone. There's lots of schools now, they're facing real challenges about how they navigate temporary accommodation. They've got lots of kids in their classrooms that are arriving late or might have developed behavioural issues, in part because they are in temporary accommodation as well. So there are significant impacts of it on kind of health and well-being, employability, and so on. And this is perhaps one of the most kind of starkest figures for me. So I mapped the eldest individual in temporary accommodation across London. That data doesn't exist anywhere else, I'm afraid. The government publishes data on individuals that are 75 and over, but it doesn't tell you exactly how old they are. And I had a theory that there might be someone that was 100 years old in temporary accommodation. I wanted to test the theory. Well, the oldest person we found was 97 years old. And I went to visit that 97-year-old in temporary accommodation, and I spoke to her daughter and her son-in-law, and they were saying, we think our mother and mother-in-law is unfortunately going to die in temporary accommodation, because they'd already been in there for 5 years at that point. So there's a real kind of human misery, unfortunately, attached to temporary accommodation, and which is why it must be a kind of crusade to tackle it, as the Labour government had done in the noughties. We need a kind of similar kind of vigour, or at least begun to in the noughties, made some progress to tackle it completely. Of course, we must take that kind of same kind of resolute approach this time if we're really going to make a dent or make progress on that front. Now, I should probably at this point, and maybe I should have done it sooner, talk about what temporary accommodation is and why it isn't. In some cases, it's individuals living in hotels. They might be sharing facilities in kind of council-run hostels or private-run hostels. They might not have access to Wi-Fi, so it might be particularly difficult if you're a student and you want to do your homework from home, or if you're you work from home and you live in your hotel room. You might not have access to washing machines, and Alison mentioned this kind of right to wash. One of the things I found really, really fascinating, I almost kind of felt like an anthropologist really interviewing the individuals about how they experienced washing machines. Such a kind of ordinary thing, we all take it for granted that we might pop downstairs or pop in the kitchen and wherever we might have the washing machine and do our laundry. But a lot of the people I spoke to said they had to do laundry a certain time of the week. So it might be a family that only had a kind of 10 p.m. slot, or it was a site of interpersonal conflict because they lived in a hostel with 20 other households and not everyone respected the rules, or the washing machines were always broken because some local authorities have kind of industrial scale washing machines, but they're kind of consistently used, but they just don't last very long. And so lots of people would say, well, our clothes never really feel clean. They always feel wet when we take them out. Sometimes we just wash them in my room. Others would say they would rather pay more expensive laundrettes. And it really spoke to the kind of lack of dignity that people felt that they had in temporary accommodation. And when I would visit these hostel sites and I would speak to people, they would always kind of use the language, or often use the language of kind of the NHS or the army, really. They would talk about kind of barracks or wings to describe the hostels they were in, or they would talk about how sterile the place was. Often I went to accommodation that was clean, but clearly quite dated, and it felt like you was entering a kind of, a hospital waiting room. And in an environment where you might need to stay there for a short amount of time where you are going to get settled on more secure accommodation, that might be understandable. In an environment where you're living there for 10 years, then it becomes much, much more problematic. What have I got on the next slide? Yes. Then we've got the length of stay. So not only are the circumstances in which people are living really problematic, but how long they are there is increasingly getting longer. And I must admit, I don't have a fixed idea in my mind about whether or not this is necessarily a bad thing, in part because some people might be in more secure accommodation for longer periods of time, and other people might be in hotels for longer periods of time. And so you really need to look at the individual case. It might be that someone's in the private rented sector and that the local authority just hasn't discharged its duty to that individual. So there is some nuance, but on the whole, as I mentioned, individuals have been there for much longer than they had. And there are some loopholes. So if you are in a hotel for longer than 6 weeks, I think it's for households with children, then that's kind of, that's recorded against the name of the authority. That is not something you should be doing. However, if it's a hostel that's council owned, then the 6-week rule doesn't apply, and that's not because the accommodation is any better, but that's just how the legislation was set out at the time. And so there is a kind of navigating some of the legal frameworks in this as well, which might look better on paper, but don't actually improve the outcomes of individuals in those places. The other issue to point out is the distance in which people are being placed as well. Increasingly, people are being sent out of their local area. That might mean that, again, they might get access to a better form of temporary accommodation. And I'm kind of clutching at straws here because I'm instinctively resistant to the idea that there are good and bad forms of temporary accommodation. I recognise and know that we need to end it, but I also recognise that in practice that's going to take a very long time. But you might be further afield in a private rented flat and you're there for a long period of time, or you might be much closer to your original home and your school and your support networks, but again, you might be in that kind of hotel with shared facilities. You might not be able to cook your meal, you might only have access to a microwave if you're in a hotel. And so out of area placements are problematic, but also I think we need to look at them in a kind of nuanced way as well. But above all, though, there's a huge amount of just incoherence in the system. You know, what we have is, and this is no reflection on these individual local authorities, it's that, you know, they are kind of playing out the failure of government policy consistently over decades. But, you know, if you are Bexley at the top of this image, you are sending 35 people out of your local area because you can't find accommodation for them in your local area. At the same time, a number of other local authorities are sending 118 people in your area. And so the inability of kind of the system to be coherent or work together is really kind of instructive of the decisions sometimes that places make about homelessness. And I think I would kind of particularly point to Haringey on that list, because it sends out almost the same number of people that are sent into that borough. And there are, in theories, ways of local authorities speaking to one another and kind of working together, but the crisis is so acute and they're all kind of really stretched financially. And that means that they are just making decisions so quickly, they don't have time to kind of step back and get under the skin of the real challenge and kind of how they might navigate that. In a piece of work I done for Prospect magazine on this, an individual I spoke to kind of called it the musical chairs scenario, where, you know, people were moving on a kind of chessboard or, you know, consistently being moved around London. And again, that creates a whole range of new and emergent issues. That means that, you know, individuals might not be able to speak to their social worker, or their social worker might have to travel further distances to support them. That makes it much more difficult for them to get access to that type of support. So how do we fix it? You know, and how do we make sure that families can live with dignity? The first point to make is there is no silver bullet. It's really difficult, and it's going to take some time to turn this around. It is a moral crusade. It has been a moral crusade for Labour in the past. It has always been a moral crusade, and the noughties kind of exemplified that. But it's also a kind of, it's economically sensible as well. You know, this government wants to make sure that it's supporting people in work. It's very difficult to support people in work if they're consistently being moved in substandard accommodation. So giving people the security of housing enables them to kind of move into the workplace or remain in the workplace. So we know almost nothing about how homelessness affects the employment prospects of individuals. Some local authorities do record that data, but most people don't. And so in Islington, for example, we know that 11% of households are in full-time employment, but we have no idea whether or not, like the individual I spoke to in Woolwich, who said, I was in full-time employment, but I can't get to work at 9 a.m. anymore. So I do 2 days a week as effectively at the kind of school gates of a school in the afternoons. And that's all, the only work I can get that enables me to get to work on time, to drop my kid off before school and pick my child up afterwards. But the government has showed, and I'll finish in 2 minutes, Alison. I'm conscious that I'm clearly very bad at timekeeping. But you know, the government has given us cause for some optimism. It's setting out a homelessness strategy. We should see that later in the year. It's been really serious in its commitment to building homes. That's not going to address temporary accommodation in the short term, but it will help in the longer term. It has also made funding available, and where it has looked at funding, it's also, for example, with the homelessness prevention grant, it's also said, actually, you know, we're concerned that this is not being spent on prevention, and we want to create the right incentives to make sure we do that. Because one of the big things that New Labour done was really focus quite systematically on prevention, and that's one of the things that we're missing at the moment. But the final point I would just make, and why I'm kind of quite optimistic about this area, is the government's embarking on some quite serious kind of administrative reform. And it sounds incredibly technical and incredibly boring. But what does that mean? Well, the government's trying to realign the boundaries of local authorities and the NHS so that so that they are in alignment with each other. And that means that the NHS and local authorities can then have a serious conversation about how together they can take kind of health-informed approaches to tackling temporary accommodation. At the same time, mayors are increasingly being empowered, and what's really clear is that this challenge is so acute that individual local authorities just don't have the capacity, capability, funding, whatever you want to call it, that they cannot manage this challenge alone. And so strategic authorities or combined authorities in old money are operating at a scale which local authorities aren't. And I think that's going to present real kind of opportunity to tackle homelessness. And we've already seen, you know, Andy Burnham, for example, in Greater Manchester be quite confident about the work he can do on homelessness. And I think as mayors step into that space, we again might see some kind of more innovation that might help us tackle this issue. So Alison, I'll stop there, shall I?
That was brilliant, though. Really, absolutely fascinating. Do you want to stop sharing your screen and we can?
Yeah. Has that stopped?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Gosh, some things feel too big to be able to know how to sort of approach them. And what you've done is really, really articulately and interestingly laid out the size and the scale of the problem. I've got a couple of questions. One is I'm interested in those of us who were around in the early 2000s, we felt that we could end street homelessness. We felt that that was something that was within our grasp if you got, you know, money, funding, determination, everything else lined up. I worry that we are in a space now where you feel like, oh, you can get every single duck in a row that there is. And I don't know that people think this is a problem that can be solved. And I just wondered what your level of optimism is. And then, so from the existential, I suppose, approach, because I think that matters. If you approach a problem as if you cannot solve it, then you're not going to solve it. On a very practical level, I just wondered if you'd done anything in around allocations. Because I'm not sure that allocations agreements of local authorities are necessarily always as helpful as they can be in this space. So two things from me, and then we'll open it up.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Alison. How optimistic am I? So I spent quite a lot of time speaking to local authorities, and my sense kind of 5 years ago, so broadly my sense is that there's quite a lot of bad practice in terms of how you tackle temporary accommodation. And I don't say that in a kind of pejorative way. I think that presents an opportunity. And one of the reasons I think that is because it's only in the last couple of years where it's become a particularly pronounced financial risk for local government, that there's been kind of more, I think, thought leadership and focus from that dimension. I totally appreciate there's a whole voluntary sector out there that's been spending on this, so it's not new. But what doesn't work on social care, and they're only beginning to kind of really explore innovation and look at prevention much more deeply. And so I think maybe that, there we go. Fantastic. So I think there's scope there to be optimistic. I think really the kind of challenge at the moment is to stabilise temporary accommodation. Every quarter when the data is published, temporary accommodation is increasing. So we need to get to a point that we can stabilise it before we can turn it around. And so, you know, I'm tentatively optimistic. What does progress look like by the end of this Parliament? Something that is down on the current temporary accommodation numbers, hopefully, but probably not much further than that. And then in terms of allocation schemes, do you mean kind of arrangements between individual local authorities, or do you mean council's actual allocation, social housing allocation?
So I was thinking about how, you know, what social housing stock we have got. I mean, one of the biggest changes in 2010, 2011 was doing away with the local authorities needing to discharge the duty into the social housing sector. And I genuinely believe that discharging into the PRS just creates a revolving door of people. So it's just, are we using our social housing stock in a way that alleviates the use of temporary accommodation or exacerbates it?
Yeah, really good question. Edinburgh Council a couple of weeks ago said that they were only going to use their stock for temporary accommodation for the next couple of months because the crisis was that acute. And well, I don't think any authorities in England, or at least to my knowledge, have been really explicit about that. The proportion of households, the proportion of their social housing stock that's in temporary accommodation or kind of presented as homeless is increasing. And so I think they are looking at how they can make sure that people in TA, which is very, very costly to the local authority, are in social housing. In terms of whether or not they're doing enough, I mean, I'm not an expert in this space, but one reflection I always have is that local authorities still own quite a lot of land, and I think there's always an opportunity to be creative about how you use your land. There are modern methods of construction that can provide temporary accommodation sites. Again, they are not the kind of permanent solution, but they might be better than the situations that individuals are in. So I do think there is an opportunity to be much more creative about that. That's one thing I'd pick out.
And beautifully segued to see Lewis Herbert's hand go up. So Lewis, for those of you who don't know, was a long-time Labour leader of Cambridge City and now doing some really exciting work in MMC. Is that right, Lewis?
Yeah, so I like the last comment there, Jack. But I like the report with Just Life even more. I think it really does hammer in some messages, and the use of data cleverly puts across human stories without necessarily interviewing people. I think I guess where it starts for me is, where's the 39 billion going to go? Housing providers have been taking the Tory money and spending it wrongly, but that's the way they were told to spend it. Cambridge City is up to nearly 1,000 council homes built since 2018. I would just hope that councils are given the incentive, because we were not allowed to bid for Homes England money. And it's I just think that when comparing yourself, Jack, to Aneurin Bevan and what he did so quickly after the war was, there was people moving into modern methods, prefabs by October 1945, and within 2 years, most councils in the country were involved in building affordable rent homes. So I would hope that the councils do get a say, and it's not my main point. It's not my main point, but finally, I was on a combined authority. A Tory mayor took 45 million out of 100 million affordable housing pot, and he gave it to his council, his former district council, to gamble, and strangely to one private developer. And Cambridgeshire lost 1,000 affordable homes gap funding. So I'm not the biggest fan of mayors. I will take my hat off to the London mayor and what's been achieved by top slicing Homes England money. So I'd just like the money to go to where the temporary accommodation and where the housing problems are most acute, as well as helping people across England.
Thank you. So I'll take a couple more, Jack, and then you come back.
Yeah, by all means.
We go to Amina and then Asma.
Hi, thank you. Hi, thank you, Jack. That was really good and really detailed, so thank you for that. My quick one is on prevention and also the link with the NHS and homelessness. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, what kind of prevention you think we need in terms of preventing two things really: the increase in homelessness, and also to look at the health situation of people who are already living in homeless accommodation, and some of them live in really awful accommodation and awful situations, and the detriment that has on health, and what the government's thinking is around trying to align health and housing together. And if you think that's a good idea yourself, having done your research, if you could talk about those two things, that'd be great.
Thank you. We'll just take Asma.
Thanks, Alice and Jack. That was really good. Thank you so much for that presentation. I was just going to ask the other part of the details or presentation you did. The other part of the picture is when we think about prevention is really what are the factors that are causing the pressure, and that will be due to immigration. That's going to be due to you know, worsening of health, lots of different issues like that. There are, let's be realistic about the fact that within social housing and within homelessness is a vicious cycle. So those that you get into temporary accommodation, then you've got them into a secured home, then they're back into homelessness, or they could go into what we call PRS, private rented scheme, and because of landlords and, you know, they want to sell or they've got a higher rate, they will evict over time, those families or those people that are living in those private homes, and then they're back again at the homeless department. And so, you know, it's really important when we're working on prevention that we're taking that full picture, and I know a detailed research of that's why I'm quite hopeful like you are, Jack, about what the future looks like, about really tackling the situation with homelessness. On allocations, yes, you're absolutely right about being creative about some of the solutions. And with what you said, I'll add, meanwhile use, I will add the idea of conversions. And you know, you touched on a couple of examples. I think Haringey was one of them. Tower Hamlets is same. 52% of our homeless families are outside of Tower Hamlets, and then the number of homes, private rented homes that are acquired by other local authorities is enough to serve our own residents. And that's the thing with the new powers that have come into the London Mayor. I'd like to see, and I'd like more of us to talk about regulating that, because keeping homeless families within the borough has lots of social benefits about work, about childcare, about all of that. Those who are fleeing domestic violence or, you know, really toxic relationships, it's mostly women that find it difficult to get back to work. And I'd like us to talk more about that, because keeping them next to their support system and where the doctors are and where the kids' school are has a lot of benefits that, you know, putting pressure onto the NHS or the local authority. And we should really be able to walk and talk at the same time.
Brilliant, thank you, Asma. Do you want to take those three, Jack, and then I'll go on to cover?
Yeah, well, there's a huge amount in that. So let me just share a kind of couple of reflections. I think kind of one of Lewis's broader points is that we absolutely need to see the public sector and specifically local authorities building more homes. And I must admit, I've never quite understood the economics of house building for local authorities. So if you are a local authority, you might, for example, borrow from the Public Works Loans Board. You will have to service that debt. So that debt will come off your kind of general fund, your day-to-day services. You'll build homes. Yes, you'll get new council tax receipts for them, but those people are not cost-free. You'll still need to collect their bins. And so I've kind of always asked myself, you know, how do we incentivize local authorities to build? And, you know, to what degree should we, you know, require them to borrow significant amounts of money to do that? And so I think there are some kind of legitimate questions about how we think about that. There are some minor things like, do you make the borrowing rate slightly more attractive from the Public Works Loans Board? Now, the Public Works Loans Board's got a fascinating history. It sounds incredibly dry. It's debt policy in the Treasury, but actually the Public Works Loans Board helped build Trafalgar Square. That was built with Public Works Loans Board money. So it can do a huge amount, and local authorities borrow a huge amount from Public Works Loans Board, PWLB, but we do need to think, I think, how local authorities are able to build, and I don't think that work's been done yet. I think the work so far has been on supply side reform, rightly, on how we make it easier for private developers, but there is more work to be done on supporting the public sector. Just on kind of health, prevention, etc., etc. I mean, one of the things we need to avoid doing, there are scenarios in which governments can reduce the overall temporary accommodation figure because they've made it more difficult for people to get into temporary accommodation. And that's right in some places, but what that can also do is kind of cost shun and, effectively adult social care or another service across a place picks up the tab, or the NHS picks up the tab. And so you want to avoid doing that. There are things like the Renters' Rights Bill, which will end Section 21, which present an opportunity, I think, to tackle temporary accommodation. And family breakdown is often another key driver of temporary accommodation. And so, while local authorities are kind of pretty good now at speaking to people and saying, look, this is the reality of temporary accommodation you'll face, can we work with you to improve the kind of relationship breakdown? There still is a kind of unmet housing need, and a lot of this does come back to supply. And so, prevention is often kind of conceptualized in all sorts of ways, from what can we prevent in, for 3 weeks, so someone presents 3 weeks later because that saves us a bit of cash, or what can we prevent in the next 12 months because those are savings in our annual budget, if you're a local authority, to much broader stuff, which ends up not really being prevention around homelessness, but generalized kind of anti-poverty stuff. So if you're a local authority and some local authorities have done this, my own in Barking and Dagenham has done it, brought together a whole host of kind of data sets to identify the types of people that you think are in need, and proactively going out to those people and saying, can we help you? So anticipating that they might at some point in the future become homeless. Is that the responsibility of a kind of homelessness service, or is that a general kind of thing that councils should do? And that really matters, because you get into all sorts of difficult questions about who should fund that and how it should be funded and at what point. And so, prevention is a really loose concept. Just very quickly on one point on health. I mean, one of the points on health is that the NHS and local authorities often have the same objectives, but different funding flows. So lots of money's going to the NHS to do some work around homelessness, and equally money's going to local authorities. The good thing about mayors is that they can chair or co-chair the integrated care boards or partnerships. In my view, I take Lewis's criticism about conservative mayors in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. I'm not defending them. But I think there are a kind of opportunities there that mayors present. And then I just want to make one point on regulation, just kind of riffing off Asma's comments, which is, in the work that we've done, hotels are making a huge amount of profit from homelessness. Now, in one respect, they are supporting kind of manage that need. Local authorities say, well, we're not particularly happy that they're in hotels and they're extremely expensive, and we recognise that they're not the most suitable options, but they are better than the alternatives in some cases. And so I'd speak to local authorities that would say, we've gone to Travelodge and we've said we want to negotiate a better deal. We want to access your conference room once a month on a Tuesday so that our kind of social care staff can speak to the residents in there we support. We recognise you're a hotel and you'll have guests in your hotel that are not in temporary accommodation, and so you can't have a social care support worker on the ground floor every day, but we want to do that. We also want to make sure that you provide free Wi-Fi. Some hotels do provide free Wi-Fi, others it's an additional charge, and sometimes local authorities pay and sometimes they don't. We also want to explore how we can help the residents in that hotel access nutritious meals, is another option. And some of these big hoteliers have said, thanks but no thanks. And I think you can do that to an individual local authority leader. Unfortunately, I'm a lowly backbench councillor in my patch, but I can't imagine any local councillors would have the political capital to kind of move the dial on a large international hotelier. And so this is where I think mayors can begin to exercise their kind of significant profile and reach, and start saying to some of these hotels, come on, let's get around the table and negotiate some better terms that are better for local authorities and better for the residents that we exist to serve.
Thank you. A couple of references for people. One, if you've not seen it, a report that came out at the back end of last year. It was commissioned by Southwark, but it was jointly funded by 100, I think, council landlords across the country. It's about securing the future of council housing. Part of it authored by Toby Lloyd and Rose Grayston. It's well worth a look. It's a very serious piece of work. And the other, it was good a couple of weeks ago on red brick, to get a report from two of, I think we can call them big beasts of the Labour housing world, John Perry and Steve Hilditch, looking back at 30 years of debate around exactly this subject, and what do we need to do to change the rules to be able to allow councils to build. I'd recommend both of those reports to people on the call. Thank you for your patience, Kevin.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to say Jack's done an absolutely fantastic job on describing the housing crisis and the issues that are faced within it, and obviously some of the solutions that can be put forward to deal with it. But I think the main thing, I've got to say, I think the main thing's got to be is building council housing. You know, housing that is properly regulated, housing where the rents aren't going to go up extortionately, like with private landlords or some, dare I say it, housing associations. And you mentioned an interesting thing about the public works loan.
Yeah.
Which I was actually quite interested in, because I was thinking, if we're going to put up council housing and we want to try and sort of pay some of that loan off, one idea might be to put, you know, solar panels on new council blocks, so that part of the revenue generated from those panels can go towards paying off that loan. I mean, obviously, it's going to benefit the residents because they need to have electricity that's affordable and it's going to take them out of fuel poverty. But of a small section that can be taken off and drip fed into paying that loan off, I was thinking that could kind of potentially make things a little more sustainable. And my final point as well on council housing is I think one thing that's really going to help sell council housing to people in terms of getting more built is resident involvement, and I think resident empowerment, because I found before I moved onto an estate that was run by a tenant management organisation in partnership with the local council here in Birmingham, I found that there wasn't really much resident empowerment or resident involvement. I mean, I just like going back about 8 years ago. Where I live now is a TMO. We've got a lot of resident involvement. There's a lot of resident empowerment. And I think it's good to give the residents a stake in saying how their estate is run, what improvements they'd like to see carried out on the estate, what services they might like to have put in. So, say for example, at my TMO 4 Towers, what I've done is I've got us involved with an organisation called Gateway Family Services, and what they do is they provide sort of support for like elderly people, young families, people with disabilities and health problems. And they're really, really good, and they help sort of nip a lot of problems in the bud by getting people access to the, you know, the right financial support, the right social support, social prescribing, which is really helpful for people as well. And also, you know, they can also help combat fuel poverty as well, because I know they say when you go on an estate, if you notice there's not a lot of lights on in the evening, it's because there's some people on that estate who just can't afford to have the lights on all the time when they need to have them on. So again, you know, we've got them involved with Groundwork UK, which is a social justice environmental charity. And what they do is they can sort of get people on the right tariffs, so they're not paying too much, get them sort of, you know, energy saving measures like energy saving light bulbs, draft strips, room thermometers, but basic but simple things, but things nonetheless that make a real difference and it can really help to get people's bills under control and, improve their quality of life. So yeah, I think so key factors, I'm going to wind up now. So the key factors are got to be, let's build council housing. Let's focus on that, getting council housing built. Let's expand resident empowerment and resident involvement. Let's give residents a say in the support that they need so that they can live the best lives. And let's get out there and get these things done. So yeah, thank you very much for letting me speak. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Kevin. And so a question, can I just ask a rude question? Because I'm thinking, is Bob Young the same Bob Young who used to be chief exec at Local Space?
Bob Young.
Who's on the call? Give me a nod. You are. No, I'm sorry, I'm just asking, because if you are, it'd be interesting to hear about Newham. But a question for you, Jack, based on what Kevin was saying about, we need to concentrate on building council housing. We've got this 1.5 million. It really struck me that we missed a trick by not saying anything about tenure mix in there. And I just wondered what side of that fence you were on. Should we have put a number on?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, let me pick up those points. So the PWLB, the borrowing, unfortunately, I think is about 100 billion that local authorities have borrowed. So they will always, it's a good idea on income maximisation to make it more kind of sustainable. But I think solar panels and small changes like that will make a really, really small dent in that level of borrowing. Just on kind of community engagement, empowerment, etc. I mean, I think you're kind of spot on, and there are some direct crossovers to temporary accommodation. So I sat on a planning committee for 3 years. I'm not an expert, but it always struck me that it's quite an adversarial regime, isn't it? You have a yes or no say if you're a resident, and I always felt kind of two things. What about if we move the conversation away from yes, no to kind of what would you like your place to look like, and how can individuals inform that process? And I think quite a lot of organisations, are beginning to do this quite well, where they're not just doing the old kind of dusty community consultation. They're getting out there into the communities, they're speaking with people, they're doing some quite creative, quite engaging stuff. They're bringing, replica models and all of these sorts of things, and they seem to go down quite well. But the second question I always asked is, we only ever hear from people that are already there, and we have no way of kind of hearing the voice of the people that are in temporary accommodation that might benefit from, or in any other tenure, but would be moving into this property that might benefit. And that's always kind of felt to me as a weakness in our system. There are kind of initiatives that are kind of emergent and developing. Just Life, the homelessness charity that I'm a trustee of, has developed kind of temporary accommodation action groups, or tags for short, and a number of London authorities, but other authorities outside of London have begun to kind of use them as a way of engaging tenant voice. I think Islington Council actually has someone with lived experience on one of their committees or working groups and so on. So really kind of bringing them into the town hall, as it were. And I think we need to go much further on those, but there are some optimistic signs there. In terms of tenure mix, yeah, so obviously the homelessness charities have used the figure 90,000, haven't they? In Scotland, I learnt the other day, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong, Alison, I feel like you might know this. They have figures for affordable homes, but they don't have a total figure for what they want to achieve. So it's the kind of reverse of what we've got for the UK government. I feel like I don't know enough to give an informed decision, but I also think that's a cop-out. And so I should say that part of governing is making choices, and we need to be intentional about being clear that we expect some of our housing to be social housing. one of the benefits I think that might have created, a kind of byproduct, is it would have perhaps forced us to have more conversations about how you finance and fund social housing. And that's, of course, a big challenge at the moment.
What the absolute difference, Jack, between you and I is the fact that I don't know something about something has never ever stopped me giving an opinion, and I sort of that's the difference between and someone with an academic view of life and someone with a big mouth from Wigan, I'm guessing. But we need all of us in our movement. So I was just saying, Bob, did you set up local space in Newham? And is it, because I think that's a real an absolutely amazing success story of a housing association set up by a local authority in order to try and solve some of these problems. And I don't know, Jack, if you will know local space, presumably.
I've seen them on Twitter. I can't say I know a huge amount about them. No, maybe the audience here wants to hear about them, though. If you're willing to share, Bob, we're putting you on the spot here and you are on mute.
We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Brilliant.
Yeah. I mean, I'm an old guy, so I've been busy with homelessness since the 1960s. And the story remains the same to some extent. In order to deal with homelessness before the 77 Act, when I was responsible for homeless families, I squatted families in empty police houses in Manchester and got sacked for it because there was no statutory duty. There was only circular guidance on local connection. That was a real problem. When I went to Birmingham as City Urban Renewal Coordinator in the 70s, we had to set up law centres in order to equip people with the rights to make the council deliver housing for them. 3 law centres. Andrew Arden I appointed to run the first one. And he animated the whole of the young, enthusiastic lawyers in Birmingham to start to support people so they could get their rights. So it's not just about the law, it's also about being able to utilise it. As you might know, Alison, I was then the Deputy Director of Housing in Hackney for 7 years, where we had 1 or 2 problems. And subsequent to that, I was the Director of Housing in Manchester for 5 years when we eliminated temporary accommodation because, first of all, we turned the ground floor of the town hall extension into a reception area, a safe reception area with people, security guys to boot out blokes that have been beating up women so we could look after people and their children. I had built 2 30-bed overnight direct access hostels and 4,000 units of move-on accommodation, half of it furnished, so we could get people out there. It's not just about simple rehousing, it's about recognising it's very complicated. We also created a wet house and a dry house, and we supported treatment centres for people who were into crack and other stuff. All these things are part of a package. Sadly, a lot of this structure has collapsed in 14 years of, it's not just the Tories, but I have watched it collapse. It's terrible, absolutely terrible. But when I got to Newham with Robin Wales, I did Newham's housing strategy for him, 10-year housing strategy, 99 to 2009. But in 2002, Ken Livingstone gave us the nod that we're going to get the Olympics in 2012. Robin Wales said, he asked me if I could acquire a portfolio of property around the Olympic site. So the council got the upside of the value lift. So I said, well, it's possible, but, can you give me 400 or 500 of your hard to let flats? Can you take them out of the housing revenue account, put them into the general fund, give them to him for 15 years. It was a big political challenge for him. People said, Robin, you can't give away council houses. I mean, half of them were empty and the other half were a bit knackered anyway. They were a top of tower blocks. I went to Savills, they valued them at 50 million. I went to the Royal Bank of Canada, borrowed 200 million quid, and I started buying houses around the Olympic site and doing them up to a high standard. There's a quality issue here about temporary accommodation as well as the existing stock. And I'll tell you, it's a white knuckle ride. At 10 a week is you're spending between £3 and £4 million a week. And if you don't spend all that 200 million quid in 2 years, the non-utilisation penalty is 30 million quid. So Robin had to take a life policy of me for 30 years in case I perished halfway through. Now, I'm not going on a bit about this, but local space was about quality. It was temporary accommodation. However, back to the point about tenants' involvement, we had a tenant board right from the outset. We got all kinds of, not that awards are important, but we got recognition from a lot of people busy with tenants' involvement that we were enabling and empowering people to determine the way the outfit was run. And it was successful. And as you know, probably I then took it to coastal space and worked with the leader at Hastings. But in Hastings, we addressed this terrible accommodation in St. Leonard's. There, I put together an enforcement team. We did the CPO work. We beat the crap out of the landlords. We bought up these bad HMOs and turned them into apartments for temporary accommodation for homeless people. So there are solutions, but councils need to get a bit bolder and sweat their assets and be more imaginative about how they do it. I think there are all kinds of glimmers of hope with this Labour government, but I don't think the answer lies in building more council houses, because the big question is who's going to, building more houses generally, who's going to get them? And what about quality? I think that my background's in environmental health and enforcement. I am not interested in being told that modern methods of construction and passive solar houses are good for people, because all the evidence from the building research establishment is that air quality in these new homes for elderly people and mums with little kids, people that are in all day, we're now getting bicinosis, we're getting asthma, we're getting all kinds of reports. And I'm troubled that the housing associations are not doing the monitoring. Anyway, look, I've gone on for too long. There's a lot to unpack about this.
But absolutely fascinating, Bob. Thank you. And Jack, what I take from that is there's not one solution that fits everywhere. And actually, you need some bold and I'm trying to think of a polite word and I can't. You need some mavericks out there who will just get on and crack on and do it. Is that what this government wants to hear, do you think?
Well, so I'm not sure what time you're finishing up, so maybe this is the last comment I'll make. The government plays a role in setting the rules of the game, and that's vitally important. But one of the points we wanted to make in the research we did recently that I've been saying to local authorities is you also do have agency, and I think too often, institutions will point at government, and actually there is some creative stuff that housing associations and local authorities could be doing. To Bob's point.
Brilliant, thank you. You're terrible chairing. Sorry, we've kept you longer than we meant to. But Jack, thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. Yeah. And we'll make you come back in a year and tell us. I think we need to start. One thing Labour Housing Group actually can do is hold that accountability piece on the housing strategy. Maybe when we've got the homelessness strategy, if we got someone like Matt Downey from Crisis to come along and talk to LXG, I think that'd be really interesting. But for now, could you just all join me in saying a big thank you to Jack? And I think Josh, who is our next guest? Is it Duncan Bowie?
That's right, yeah, in August.
In August. So if we don't see you before then, enjoy the summer and try not to get too hot.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks, Alison.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, bye, bye.
Thank you.